Hello, rantboxtv. Welcome to the next episode of hopefully a series that you have been watching for some time. And if it's your first time, great. You're about to witness us talk about, well, commentary on race, gender, and other community concerns in 21st century Britain and abroad. We're subject driven, and so we'll avoid the risk of spending 15 to 20 minutes introducing the entire panel. They can introduce themselves when they speak, and if you watch until the end, you can find out more about them at that point. If you're watching the full-length version of this on YouTube, please like the content, hit like and hit subscribe. Today's question is the second part of our last group discussion, which was how has the idea of the superhero benefited fictional media and what is the case for its negative impact of modern content? So we've got various different categories. We're going to start off with literary fiction. Mark, you have something to say.
It has had a negative impact, I think, in a way, because it's made like a certain demographic of fiction just not trashier, but very easily accessible. Like, sometimes people write novels and that person is a superhero and it allows a very free, or, that person has a power that is akin to a superhero and that lets them have free reign over certain choices. So it has impacted negatively as well, I think.
Okay.
And there's a lot of fan fiction out.
I mean, I think it's very interesting to look at the impact of superheroes on fiction in that way, especially as you kind of have this almost heroic dualism, like a two branches of heroism almost, where you have a kind of a moral absolutism, which is about kind of objective justice and the idea that there are good people and bad people and they fall into these lines, and the hero is the person who enforces the good rules as they were, as they are, and that's like one side of it. But then on the other side, you have this kind of analysis of, what does it mean to be a good person with a lens to kind of extra abilities,
Yeah.
And I find the idea of analyzing those in two different ways very interesting to look at. Though I think I probably come down slightly more on the sort of Alan Moore moral ambiguity side than the kind of absolute justice side, personally.
Yeah,
Definitely. I mean, I think off the back of that, you'd have the old trope from Spider-Man of great power and great responsibility, and when you have that power in the wrong hands, which has been examined, frequently in more modern superhero books, where you have the likes of someone like Hyperion, who is the Marvel analog of Superman from DC. Originally, he was a character that had he was a character that had a negative outlook, and he wasn't brought up necessarily correctly, originally, but he's now gone on to lead other groups and so forth, and he's much more well regarded, and he's a rounder character. But then you also have characters such as Sentry as well, Robert Reynolds, who deals with mental instability as well. And that, for me, when I started reading about his comics and his battles with his alter self, which is the void and so forth, really spoke to me about, having that duality in yourself. And on this note, many from what I'm reading and what I've researched, PhD students from across the board, but especially in psychotherapy, have looked at comics and so forth as bases for their theses, because obviously some of the characters are very accessible, and they're things that you picked up from when you were 5, 6, 7 years old and stayed with you up until the point that you're actually writing your final pieces.
Yeah, I'd say you've got a good point there. I think that the superhero as an idea has had a very nomadic existence. If you look at, say, Doc Savage, or if you look at The Shadow, and both these characters coming from Pulp Fiction, when they transgressed into, like, say, the superhero comic book form, they were mutated into, say, Batman and Superman in terms of ideas. And in that, say, that medium, which I think a lot of people saw as quite juvenile at the time, the inherent idea of a comic book page is to brandish you with action and splash events where you're not necessarily looking for any kind of inherent philosophy or discussions. You're looking at action. And so for a while in that playpen, moving through, like, say, Timely Comics that would soon later become Marvel Comics and whatnot, you had all these characters and whatnot that weren't necessarily able to make their nomadic trip back into quote unquote book prose form, to a point where if you have an idea for a story which has a superhero in, most people are probably going to come to the conclusion that it has a better place in the comic book world, or now in the movie landscape. Has anyone heard of G. Willow Wilson?
Yeah.
No.
Yeah. G. Willow Wilson is like the co-creator of Miss Marvel. She also wrote a book in, well, it came out in 2012 called Alif the Unseen. Now, Alif the Unseen is kind of like mixing the Arab Spring, hackers, and Middle Eastern mythology. And it's such a wild mix of stories that its particular interest in these transgressive concerns makes sense in the book, you know? Like the old idea that if you took Watchmen, which we discussed earlier, and you put that into book form, it would probably still communicate in a really good way. It would miss out on a lot on the action and the particular cinematic ideas that happen between panels. But essentially, you could still make that work as a book. And so my question today being, has literary fiction benefited from it? I'd say it's folded in tropes of the superhero into young adult fiction, such as stuff by G. Willow Wilson. So essentially, I mean, before you'd have magical tropes that have been going for some time. You know, I mean, the latest would be like, say, a Harry Potter type clone or whatnot. But now, when it comes to, like, say, YA fiction, if you came up with a superhero idea, I'm thinking that's going to get published quite easily. I mean, I've got a few things in my notes, so I'll add that into the description box. But there are like many, especially when it comes to diverse categories of people, whether they be non-binary, whether they be gay or trans. A lot of those, say, types of background for a character found their place in modern superhero fiction. Yeah, I've said quite a bit there. Has anyone got anything to add in regards to this part of the topic before we move on?
I just once again, I only recognized the name G. Willow Wilson when you mentioned Alf the Unseen, because I realized I've read that book, and I found it really interesting. To come back to where we started at the beginning a little bit, I find it really interesting, the idea that you have this kind of the superpower in the definition of superhero, and then you have almost like a super morality, you know, where it's like not necessarily, and you know, stepping away from justice and talking about how do you make the right decision, which is a much more complicated question than how do you enforce the law. Like, I think for me, that is a really positive, I mean, for me, it really comes down to these two separate narratives. The justice narrative, which I think is ultimately about being told what to do, which is, I think, quite a kind of a covering your ears from having to think kind of point of view. And then you have this kind of power narrative of, okay, you have the power to do something, what do you do? And I think that is a storytelling device that has so much unlimited potential in a very positive way.
Yeah, sorry, definitely. Just going back to something that we said before, with Superman, Red Sun, once again, essentially placing Superman in a different, in Russia, and the fact that he was approached by his political leader to not necessarily attack America, but to essentially be the superhero that the Soviet Union wanted, and make America fear that they would unleash their ultimate weapon. Towards the end of Red Sun, Superman actually does resolve and feels that what he's been told by his leaders isn't right, and that he should go off and do his own thing. So yeah, you definitely sort of off the back of what Matt says, I think that's exactly
I
what
think
certain people are aiming for.
I think that makes I think your point there makes comic books quite a valid medium of telling stories for the modern age where you couldn't necessarily tell them by film, especially for away from the vein of superheroes, but it's even comics like The Unknown Soldier, which is a DC comic, which is great if anyone can get a hold of it. And the premise of Garth Ennis' The Unknown Soldier is that this person's been behind all the dirty parts of American history. And it's almost like, yes, the superhero trope has folded into literature, but some of the literature's folded back into the superhero trope, where we're actually discussing geopolitical events in comics, and seeing how they've shaped our society, but also seeing how society has been shaped by those superhero tropes, like Captain America. The shield, like Simon said with Red Son, these characters were designed to be the shield of America. I mean, Captain America literally has a shield with a big star on it,
Yeah.
And in the age where there was super weapons being bred, they are very much of the Eisenhower era. And yeah, I think that would link into it. But now comics are discussing these events, like The Unknown Soldier, which talks about the Iran uprising, Vietnam, and the Cambodia incursions that happened there from US Special Forces, and discussing all these dirty bits of I love this comic. I've read it on Kindle Unlimited, and it basically goes through this whole dirty set of events over 50 years, and it turns out it's all this one guy, and he just hates himself and hates what everything's become, because in the end they decide to rescue Hitler, and that's when he finds out one of the generals tells him years after they're going to let Hitler go, but he gets killed before they can actually extract him. And it's just how like I said, it's all these things about what morality is on the negative side, but it's also showing these geopolitical events. I'm sorry, I don't know if that's really relevant, but I thought
it was interesting. It was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
We should move on to the next section because we have a certain amount of time. Radio plays, have they in any way benefited from superheroes as a concept, or have they been negatively impacted? Or if there's been no impact whatsoever, which I think is a valid answer.
Yeah,
I wouldn't say recently they haven't benefited from, because not necessarily, I suppose with the advent of the internet, we've moved in a slightly different direction. But from what I picked up previously, they were very popular when obviously radio was more popular towards the start of the century, the 1930s. You would have the likes of the Green Hornet show as well, along with obviously the Superman show in the 40s through to the early 50s as well. And there are a number of different types of those shows where you are able to expand on what you read in your Action Comics #1, and then they would take those stories and apply relatively famous or well-known actors to portray those characters on the radio as well. And I can say myself personally, I always do enjoy listening to audio plays from across the genre. So at the moment, I'm listening to the expanded universe from Star Wars and so forth, being played by a particular actor, and some of the stuff from Warhammer as well. I find that really interesting. Stuff from Dan Abnett, who's a great writer. I've read his books, but also his radio plays are really good as well. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
I find it quite interesting that I feel like movies almost inherited the legacy of radio drama, because those plays really started in the 1930s, right? Which I didn't realize coincides kind of with the popularization of the superhero comic as a genre in as well. So they kind of have this twin birth. But if you think about it, radio is just so much more accessible to the common person, right? It's literally free. If you pay you pay a licensing fee potentially to the state for certain state stations, but it's broadcast and you just tune into it. So I feel like there is a massive legacy set by radio audio fiction, but I think a lot of that does come from the justice narratives that you get around superheroes, like, as you say, Green Hornet, Superman, the Lone Ranger, if you want to look at him as a superhero as well. They are all kind of associated with the birth of radio as a storytelling form.
Very much so. I mean, it has to be said, taking us back to my idea of the superhero being a nomadic creature, characters like Superman had a lot of rebirth in radio. He couldn't actually fly before the radio show, and he couldn't actually be hurt by anything until they thought of kryptonite for the radio show. So there's something you may not know, but essentially they take what they need from different mediums, don't they? And they carry on. Now it seems to be going full circle, like they are coming back into that aforementioned subcategory of books, simply because they've taken stuff from what they've got from radio, they've taken stuff from movies. I mean, there are characters who people hadn't even heard about until they saw them or heard them in these different mediums. And so to obviously ingratiate themselves upon those audiences, producers are going to put stuff within the stories that gives them that extra life, let's say.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think the sort of, I think with radio serialization, it's gone, like, it has evolved in like two very interesting, distinct ways. And I think the like spiritual almost successor to that is webisodes. Like Halo Forward Unto Dawn was a brilliant sort of webisode series. I mean, I remember working in an office somewhere and just sitting to watch it every week as it came out. And yeah, it was brilliant. And I think that's the spiritual successor, because it is like these, you know, I think Halo Unto Dawn was released in 5-minute parts, each one, until the, you know, this sort of sequence of events finished in about 40 minutes long, I think it is. And so that's where I think that successor is. But we've also noticed a trend in Netflix with superheroes folding back into series. And like there's more serializations. Like studios are definitely investing like more money in serialization, like, you know, DC, Marvel, they've both got spin-off series. I think they've got a couple out now, you know, like some of the more minor characters like the Flash. So I think that's where that's going. But sorry,
Yeah, definitely.
I also like to link into size Dan Abnett thing, because I've completely forgotten about Dan Abnett. But one way I think the superhero trope has moved as well is back into Pulp Fiction, starting in like the 70s with Judge Dredd, and 2000 AD where that serial pulp magazine was available. And that's where we started getting our superheroes from, that were more literary, well, a little bit more sort of just weekly accessible and serialized almost. Sorry.
Does anyone know if Dick Tracy was a radio show?
It was, yes.
It was, okay, yeah, because he's crossed all mediums essentially for the benefits of this show. He's done the movies, he's in theatre, he's in radio, and obviously he's got his comic books and larger books as well. So you can see, you know, a complete ecosystem covering all four areas.
Yeah, I'd say Dick Tracy's quite malleable, and let's face it, he's quite a safe character. Like, he's great, he's white, he's a womanizer to an extent, depending on what, you know, idiom you've actually picked up on, or what iteration. And that's kind of it. Like, he's like a kind of like a cop, but I don't know, I'm not thinking that he's got a great amount of longevity going through generations. I'd say you're going to hear less about Dick Tracy as time goes on, because I don't know what 15-year-old is thinking, hey, I really love Dick Tracy, I'm going to go out and buy
I want the jacket. The jacket's still cool as hell.
Well, that's the thing. Are we thinking of the jacket that Warren Beatty was wearing?
Yeah. Yeah.
Go. You know, we're not particularly young, Simon, but
no. Yeah, I know. We look at cocoa butter.
You may want that jacket, but I don't know if, like, say, a younger person in your family is going to even know what that jacket means, let alone who Warren Beatty is. He'll probably be dead by then. Do you know what I mean? So,
yeah.
Sorry, I was going to chime in and say, like, that's kind of, we talk about minorities on this show, like, or marginalized people, and I didn't really prepare much for that, but I do have a couple of thoughts. And it was the fact that, like, 2000 AD, which I was talking about before, which is a very pulp You know, it was Pulp Fiction. You know, Judge Dredd. It's where they came from. Obviously, we don't know 2000 AD here, but it also gave rise to a lot of characters that were female and were like sort of the first like heroes who stood up for themselves as women and represented in fiction that wasn't just that sort of classic fiction. Like the Ballad of Halo Jones started in 2000 AD, one of Alan Moore's most strongest comic books ever, which is brilliant. Martha Washington originally was a strip in 2000 AD, which I don't know if Simon remembers reading the Martha Washington comic books
I
about.
remember it. I remember
Yeah,
it. I read a
yeah,
lot of 2000 AD. But
yeah, and you know, like about a black woman going into space and being a leader in a war, and then moving on to Dan Abnett's Durham Red, which is about a female
Yeah.
vampiress. Yes, and like those like all the comics are so well drawn, and she is like quite a strong character. She's quite likable. She doesn't overplay the fact that she is quite attractive in it. It's more about, you know, just that pulp, blood, guts, gore, and violence sort of thing, but you know, toned down for kids, obviously.
Yeah,
So
it was good.
I think it's been more accessible in that way. The pulp serialization of these comic books and like moving off radio plays, because there would have been radio plays, like let certain ideas be more accessible and certain writers to be freer with their conceptions that, you know, only up until now we're challenging. I mean, we're only just getting, you know, relatively used to stronger people and stronger women in movies, even, you know.
Yeah.
Like Wonder Woman only came out in 2016, I think, or 2017.
Wonder Woman was 2017.
Sorry about that. Yeah.
I'd like to say that radio plays, as far as I know, we can easily pull upon what has happened and talk about the history of it, rather than talking about like the modern day, because ultimately, as Simon was saying, he's listening to a radio play which is drawing upon the expanded universe of Star Wars. But when it comes to superheroes, I would say superheroes, again, as a nomadic entity, they don't necessarily need radio the way they used to. You know, they've pretty much found their place online or in the movie theater or in games. But I wouldn't say that, you know, your average, again, 17, 18-year-old is going to be rushing home to be listening to the radio. The imagination there has migrated. So with that in mind, can we move on to theatre? Has in any way theatre been impacted by the superhero as an idea?
Superheroes and theatre sort of fall underneath or sort of have the same concepts and ideas as well. So just looking at it, when you think of a comic book strip, it's large, big, bombastic characters who essentially have moments of touching inner thought and so forth. And this is what you find with theatre, especially. So you'll have your long monologue delivered by your main character, which will then go to your next area. Same thing with comic books.
You're right. I think there's a lot of potential for theatre to showcase a certain kind of superheroic story, simply because of the dramatic potential that can be done when you're watching something happening play out in front of you. So it's got that same immediacy and intimacy, I say, that radio has, arguably because you don't necessarily have the ability to do the stuff that you can do in films, that there is a drawback to that. And let's face it, even in comic books has, I can't remember who said it, but essentially if you have the idea of a budget in your head for a movie and you can't afford it, comics are your next best bet. Happening on 2 pages, that would cost you like 8 million otherwise. But yeah, like I definitely think that theatre has potential there. Anyone else?
I find that point you made actually about the ability, the kind of pared downness of the theatre, a very good way of kind of getting away from some of the bombast that is associated with superhero fiction. And I think there's a lot of potential there, particularly because, I mean, one of the best ways I can describe it is that I was watching a critical analysis of the fighting in Daredevil a while ago, and how choreography, like when you see an action scene in a film, you're not just watching punches land and explosions and whatever. There is a story being told. And a good fight scene actually tells you about the emotional state of the characters taking part in that fight, and you learn something about them through the action beats of that scene. And so in that way, when you take away a lot of the special effects and you just get it down to people standing in a room with some very basic, whatever you can actually get physical in front of you special effects going, I think it then takes the reins off a little bit for just characteristic expression and less of the shock and awe that you get in the auditorium, the cinema auditorium.
You watched this, it was a video, right? I think I've seen the same one. They were even using, it's fantastic if it's the same one. They were using examples of, you remember in Revenge of the Sith, and you got Anakin and Obi-Wan and they're fighting, and it looks really pretty.
Yeah.
You don't know anything about those characters just from looking at the fight, unfortunately. If you look at, say, Empire Strikes Back, the way Luke is kind of like, he's not quite able to like beat Vader because he's so arrogant about what he's doing, and Vader's just toying with him. The entire scene, when I watched it after checking out that video, it made so much sense. Yes, you can tell a story through the way they're fighting. So yeah, theatre obviously would have that aspect there, as well as films, but at the same time, as Matt says, we can get away from having the idea of how do you conceptualize a massive explosion to how do you get these guys having a certain kind of friction through the way their body is moving and the way it's blocked out on stage. That's really quite interesting.
So just a thought that just popped into my head in regards to, now this is maybe a bit off there depending how you see it, but in regards to the world of wrestling and so forth, and you know, you have
for our last section, can we say we had an agreement? We had
okay. I was gonna, it's an act.
I mean, I agree we should say that for later, but I would argue that that actually is the closest that I can think of to superhero stage plays, like
telling a story. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
All right, go on, do it.
Oh no, that's what I was going to say, because I've only picked it up again recently because I've been very bored. But when you break down a bout between your two, hyper characters, like a Sting and a Hulk Hogan, for example, they are your heroes at the time, and instead of just punching each other and so forth, they do go into a choreographed dance, which is due to tell a story as well. And they are, once again, emoting. They are essentially showing off, that they're in pain by selling and so forth. And there is that idea of spectacle and wow, that you do look towards when you go to a live theatre show as well, or ballet or anything of that nature. So yeah, I was just going to say that's where sort of wrestling.
Oh, that's fair.
I'd actually also say, sorry, it's just now that we've made that connection, it's just made me realize as well that spirit, the idea of the hero being someone you look up to as an example, especially for young kids, I think is even more exaggerated in Mexican wrestling, in luchador fights, where it's incredibly acrobatic, like they're jumping off each other, and like they've got these ones where you have smaller wrestlers with dwarfism fighting full-size wrestlers and doing these incredibly acrobatic feats of wrestling. And I think it really does do this thing of telling a story and dramatically getting an audience involved.
Sure. I have something to add to that, but you know what I'm going to do? Save that shit to the show. Viewers, we've got a new section. Basically, anything that pops up in our brains, and things will pop up in our brains, we're going to save to the end of the show. But yeah, I don't even want to go into it because it's pretty intense, and it talks about the merit of story and intersectionalism, and the basis of a lot of these stories seem to be about might being right, and it's very hetero in that way. But we'll get to that. Musicals and superheroes. Never thought I'd say that on the video, but it's happened. Does anyone have anything to say about musicals and how is a superhero as an idea impacted negatively, if at all, or positively?
We discussed and read some before. The trend has been with superhero tropes to look at the reverse of that. Superman was created as this American perfect shield in a nuclear age when someone else had a really dangerous weapon and they might use it against you. So that sort of was to give the American people like a little bit of confidence in their subconscious. But when Red Sun took that, it flipped it on its side and said, right, well, what happened if Superman was in Russia and was braced in Stalinism? Would those good human values still shine through? And then that's reflected in musicals, I think, by well, in the wider sort of cultural zeitgeist, by the examination of these anti-hero characters like Ratchet, the sort of main evil character in One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and examine what journey got her to that point. And then I think that links into musicals by looking at Wicked. You know, the principal character in Wicked is the Wicked Witch of the West, and like examining how she got to that point to be the Wicked Witch of the West.
Yeah, yeah. I think from what I saw, I don't necessarily think musicals actually have necessarily been influenced by superheroes necessarily, other than what we said in regards to theatre. Obviously, that you do have your protagonist character and so forth. But what you have seen is where they've tried to take the superhero concept and apply it to theatre musicals. One example, Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark.
Yeah.
I think everyone's heard about that one, which was a critical failure, the most expensive musical of all time at $75 million. The investors lost $60 million and it was shut down after 3 years. And the main thing, which I think is hilarious and links it back to the play that went wrong, is that some of the actors got injured as well, which of course you're going to have with, it's 127 aerial fights and so forth, which at the time, and probably still to this day, and probably what they're doing, is a marvel to on the levels that you would have with Cirque du Soleil and so forth. But once again, with the musical aspect of superheroes, musicals are big. They're very big concepts, big characters, and so forth. And I could just imagine seeing the Biff, Pow, and so forth being linked with like Stomp and other things of that nature. So there's definitely a synergy with it. I just don't know if it's been done well as of yet.
I'm quite cynical about the whole enterprise. I think it's one thing that executive producers can do is they can literally produce this amazing magical trick where you don't question how much money is being spent on the project because it's so good. Unfortunately, when it comes to musicals, there haven't really been any magicians that I can think of when it comes to superhero legacy, because it's basically them attempting to create another viaduct from that cash cow of Marvel's premier character in terms of the collective unconscious. Spider-Man, it's like, oh, Spider-Man sells, well, let's put on the show. Story's not particularly great, and you have a lot of from what I've researched, the actual accidents happened because there was a lot of mismanagement going on. And again, it's just that kind of arrogance that would breed, let alone a bad sequel trilogy. It's going to have a bad idea in terms of, if you're into musicals, if you love the idea of going to see Hamilton or even Mamma Mia or something else, which is very much, it's part of the musical, history now, but it's not necessarily a traditional musical. If you see the superhero train come into that station, you're going to view it quite cynically anyway. So if it doesn't do so well, it's like, why did they do this? What was the initial thought? Obviously to make lots of money, but is there any emotional depth to this? And it could be, Spider-Man Turn Off the Dark, it had certain aspects of Greek tragedy, and that in itself has a fundamentally link to theatre, which I'm sure I don't have to go into, but musical theatre could benefit from these stories if it's done by people who truly care about the stories, let alone the audiences.
I mean, I'm quite glad you mentioned Alexander Hamilton, because earlier on in the show, I actually thought about it in this context. And I wonder if part of the reason why we're struggling with this concept of superhero media in musicals is because of this need to take an existing IP and kind of migrate its properties onto a different medium. and if that's part of the issue. With a lot of, you know, there was another video I was watching a while back about successful musical episodes of long-running TV shows and what makes them good and what makes them bad. And usually the ones that come out rather poorly executed are the ones that don't actually understand the dramatic format of the musical and how you make a song tell a story, how those stories fit together into a wider narrative arc. And in that sense, I kind of feel like we maybe can look at Hamilton as a superhero musical, because it has a lot of the kind of the structure that you might expect with a superhero. The kind of journey is this epic kind of forming a nation kind of, if we're looking at the morality side of being a superhero, I think it quite clearly fits the mold. And then not only that, they tell it in such a way where they have a majority POC cast in these very powerful roles. And so not only do you have a story that gives you history, it gives you at least a semi-nuanced morality. It also gives you a kind of a way of looking up to this fictitious portrayal of a historical character, fine. But imagining them in this recontextualized narrative, I think has a lot of power to it.
Maybe I could be playing devil's advocate here, but maybe we're looking at the idea of, like, say, the epic story or journey of a hero, and we could be using a terminology which superheroes being part of, you know, the nowness of culture doesn't necessarily mean that what we're talking about when it comes to Hamilton is a superhero story, just an epic journey. But because of the context of us having this conversation, you know, you can't be faulted for having that connection. But I don't know if that's in some way dismissive to older stories, which, you know, which were around before the term or phraseology of superhero was coined.
You'd have someone like John Henry, the American character. I don't know too much about him, but I've obviously seen that the character of Steele has some relations to him and so forth, and
he's named after him. Like,
yeah,
to get someone who was oppressed,
yeah,
and then give them a certain power in their recent community. You know, it expresses a wider injustice through, you know.
Because I've seen a theatre play with about John Henry years and years and years ago, and yes, the hero story does resonate with that with me as well, obviously being a POC and so forth, and working through the troubling times to come out on the other side as someone that is looked up to by the community, very much similar to your superheroes, your Spider-Man in New York and Gotham. Actually not Batman, he's hated, but you know, you do have those types of characters as well.
I would recommend, I don't know if I'm wrong in this, but did you say last time you haven't yet checked out the Watchmen TV series?
I haven't yet, no.
Oh, mate, definitely check out, with this in mind, you talk about John Henry, check that out, because some of the stuff that they talk about, particularly the character called Hooded Justice, it understands that story so well, in terms of the oppressed figure given a certain bit of power in their local vicinity. But yeah, I think, do we have anything else to say on musicals and super?
Yeah, I'd just like to join in and following up with what yourself and Simon have said, and it's a bit of an out there point in a roundabout way, but bear with me because it does have some relevance. But I do want to ask the question: does the fact that the Spider-Man show failed show an inherent almost flaw in the superhero trope's armor? Because if you need to have so many aerial fights to sort of simulate what's really going, like to simulate, you know, what people expect to see, which is in a movie, does that not take away, like, it's almost like the tropes become too reliant on special effects and aerial acrobatics instead of actually focusing on the human condition of a superhero's development, which is something that, like, people invest in?
I'm going to cheat in answering this question.
Okay.
Because on the one hand, you can embrace the idea of realism by having, like, you know, your trapeze artist and whatnot, stuntman being Spider-Man in the rafters doing their thing. or you can go for something which isn't necessarily realism, and you can
That's very true.
Yeah, you can project like various things on the backdrop, can't you? Or, I mean, let's face it, do we need real cars in theatre? No, but have we seen theatrical stories that have vehicles? Yes. So therefore, there's a whole other convention there, the way that you only really truly need to think about your particular kind of advantages in film if you want to actually get across to everyone that it's actually happening. But in theatre, for them to realize it's happening depends very much on the aesthetics of the design and the people playing the role, let alone if it's body caricatures and whatnot. And not body caricatures, but you can create a door out of a couple bodies. Do you know what I mean? That kind of theatre. So
yeah, and also just off the back you said there about obviously the design and so forth, but also the collaborative effort of who's producing it as well. If you have someone who I think with the Spider-Man show, it was originally directed by a Broadway director who focused on another of other shows, but when they replaced her, they brought in comic book writers specifically who knew more about what was going on, and they also had an executive as well. He was a consultant as well, who managed to try to turn the show around, and he unfortunately wasn't able to get it off the ground as well.
Money pit, to be honest. Like,
Yeah.
not the best idea. I think if you have someone who is fundamentally a playwright first, and they have a great love of these superhero stories, you hire them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Was that a little harmonica just?
Yeah, sorry, that was my WhatsApp. Yeah.
I love it. So yeah, last section before we move into like the crazy section, as I'm going to call it. Internet web plays. Does anyone have anything to say about that? I think Matt, you had a few things to say.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I was very excited about, that I kind of saved from radio because I do feel like it's kind of a separate thing. It's kind of the legacy of radio. Though it's interesting that, I'm basically talking about podcasts, which have gone on this funny route themselves where they've kind of taken on over from radio in some senses, but then I've been finding podcasts that I listen to making their way back into broadcast radio. And I think part of that has a lot to thank from superheroes, like the draw of the superhero narrative has brought quite a few people, I think, into the podcast space that I don't think would be there otherwise. There's recently Marvel started an effort with Wolverine. They've on season 3, I think now. Some very interesting storytelling that is done using I forget the name of it. It's a special kind of recording technique where you are given spatial awareness of the recording by the way it's recorded. So if someone's speaking just behind you, you hear the voice over here instead. And so it's this incredibly immersive story that would be hard to experience in any other medium.
Wow.
And I do think, in a way, this is a great way of getting people into a medium that is kind of its own little ecosystem, that if you aren't into podcasts, it kind of falls under the wayside until one gets brought up to be turned into a film, or it gets brought up for radio. But aside from that, it's all kind of podcast geeks all sort of listening to each other's stuff. But on the other, as another branch to that, an incredible kind of crossover that I found with one show that I'm a massive fan of is called The Bright Sessions. And The Bright Sessions, for me, is a really great example of how you can take kind of the legacy of superhero culture and do something very interesting and very different that's never really quite been done before. Because the show is fundamentally about a psychologist who works for a government agency that helps keep the identities of young people with abnormal abilities hidden from the public eye. So essentially the kids from Xavier's School for Gifted Youngsters, and the format of the show is the therapy sessions for these kids who are traumatized from having to hide certain aspects of their personality. One of them can hear other people's thoughts, and he kind of ends up realizing that he's gay, and all of these like kind of complex character beats get kind of teased out through the format of these therapy sessions and radio play that I find it hard to believe could really be told successfully in another medium.
Mm.
Oh,
Definitely,
yeah.
definitely. We have the so just short quickly with my two favorite sort of channels on YouTube at the moment, it would be Comic Storian and Comics Explained, and they originally came together to discuss comics. And especially in the rise of the MCU and so forth, but they split apart into their own channels. But essentially, they deliver the medium similar in similar ways, where essentially they will take scans of the page, and they will edit it slightly so it's better as a play. And Benny, who is the comic historian, is very good at voices. Essentially, so when he's doing, for example, Punisher, and I read a Punisher comic, I hear his voice and so forth, and a number of other people. While Rob, who's over on Comics Explain, just has the best voice of all time. He just, yeah, let me tell you, son, Green Lantern's the best. He's amazing as well. And I think once again with the with the emerging technology that we have from having YouTube on our phones and so forth, I love the fact that I can just go for a walk or go running, and someone can read a relatively, because like what we said before about new comic issues coming out so often, and they're getting more expensive and so forth as well. I can't keep up with them, but with these guys, they do it in 20-minute segments of a particular issue or maybe a volume, and then after about a year or so, they'll put all of those issues together and do the full annual, which will mean you'll get the entire House of M story through to Decimation, through to the next, and they all lead together. So if I want a quick recap on something I've forgotten from Civil War years ago, I can go to that and they'll just quickly explain it to me. I'll be like, yep, got it. I'm ready to go.
I'm familiar with Comics Explained. I used to listen to that kind of like show a lot, then I had to stop because I found my brain was becoming like some kind of puddle of nonsense.
Oh, it has been. Mine is.
Seriously, I felt that I was doing myself an injustice by not revisiting the actual stories themselves, rather than this encyclopedic. It's a catalogue of all these different ideas and stories and stuff. And I think every now and again I might dip back into it, but I just feel that there was a time when I was like, I found myself at 4 a.m. listening to it. I thought, I've got to fucking stop, man. Like, anything else to say on the internet web plays and superheroes, anyway? No? Okay, that's fine. So we're at that section where you may have had an idea in your head and you wanted to basically say it, but you were nice. You didn't want to take us off road from our particular discussion. Now is that time where you can tell us your answers. Anybody?
But there's so much.
That's a lot. I want to say that the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles had a tour back in the 90s. But they didn't have the bow staff or the katana or anything. They had instruments instead, which was amazing to read today as well. Yeah.
Oh man, see, like I've lived in like pretty remote locations, as Sam will tell you. Bangor's not a very big place at all, and where I live now is even smaller. So I've never really been to the theatre, but I remember like an ex-girlfriend, like must be like 12 years ago, dragged me to see the Queen We Will Rock You musical.
Yeah.
I have never hated anyone so much as I hated that person throughout that play. Like literally it's all going on like, yes, these are freedom weapons. It was like literally, I hate you so much for this. Like,
actually,
why?
That's quite funny that Bono and The Edge wrote the music for Turn Off the Dark as well. And I think Bono said it that the whole production was quite pretentious. He didn't really know where it was going.
This is coming
Jesus
from
is-
Bono.
Yeah.
I don't even want to talk about. In fact, we've got like the next Rantbox TV episode, which is a group discussion, will be musically inspired. But I'm saying now that we can't talk about Bono. It's like
done. Cool.
God, no one likes Bono. Like, I am seriously surprised he hasn't done like a benefit concert already for this whole coronavirus thing. He's been suspiciously quiet. Maybe no one's lured him out of his cave in a while.
There's nothing suspicious. It's because he can't gain from it in any shape or form now.
Yeah.
But yeah, before we end, I wanted to share my idea before. I do think that what keeps a lot of people out of getting into superhero stuff or being completely switched off from it is the basic idea of what superheroes have been from the beginning. We may talk about justice. We may now talk about, say, gender norms. We may talk about all these progressive issues that superheroes are now becoming part of because they can't escape culture. But essentially, if you think about it, superheroes were built up as male power fantasies, right? So isn't that going to be in itself something that shows like, say, The Boys or even to an extent Daredevil have to kind of casually step away from or lampoon or in some way parody so that they can progress the idea of the superhero away from that basic feature? That was
Right.
the idea in my head.
Okay, well, don't hate me. I don't know how this is gonna go because I'm gonna make like a plug, and then like hopefully you won't like murder me, and then
You're gonna
like
plug something. I could have plugged my own book.
no, not anything to do with me. But like this is why you're really gonna hate me. So like I got Amazon Kindle on my phone, like talking about like size thing about comics. See, told you there's a plug and no one was gonna like it. But I got Kindle on my phone, and that is like if you're talking about these sort of like stepping away from these male sorts of power tropes, like that is brilliant because they've got like loads of comics on there. Like this is how I've read so many really good comics recently, like The Unknown Soldier, but they've also translated a lot of Spanish and French comics. Some of them are absolutely brilliant, and they're all on Kindle Unlimited, which I get. And you can just read them for free. You don't pay like the £2 or £3 you would have to. You just pay a subscription every month. But there's like a French one called Hell's Highway, which is about an apocalypse, and after the apocalypse, trying to walk up this road to get to a safe place. There's one called The Last of Us, which is about, I think not The Last of Us, The Last Few, which is French, and that is about a vampire I Am Legend type world, but with a woman trying to keep a group of kids alive who have become her like class that she teaches. But there was a really brilliant one that I read that was Spanish, and that was about 3 women that had been fused together to try and make this ultimate weapon on a future world. And there was like proper like I will find the name of the comic for you when I finish this piece.
Yeah, please.
That
sounds pretty out there. I don't know how to even think about it. 3 fused together to create a weapon.
Power Rangers.
It was like quite futuristic military sci-fi. So it was all about like, and their power like going across that, because we're talking in terms of like they have warplanes that look like warplanes, but they're space fighters. And then these women obviously overcome that in the corrupt society and sort of end up just like being able to just crush all these people inside the cockpits. The Book of Chaos, I think it's called.
Well, link me to that. I'm just very aware of time. Mr. Gaffen, how much time do you have before you must leave? Because I'm trying to end the show with all of us being able to, exit at the same time. And no time's a bit fast for you.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I like a good 15-20 minutes should be okay. I do have my own tiny bit of chaos to throw in at the end. Yeah, from my hand.
Definitely throw in the chaos. If you have anything to say on my latest rant in regards to let's say there's a matrix of ideas for superhero stories, and let's face it, the progression that we have in the last few years, maybe the last, say, 10, has been worthwhile, but they are going up against 90 plus years of man be powerful, man punch other man. That seems to be the basic idea, and that walls a lot of people out of finding it in any way interesting, and you can't necessarily blame them. Does anyone have anything to say on that rant at all?
I think that we have the opportunity to find characters that we look forward to hearing about in other media or in other books and so forth. And superheroes, for me personally, as I've said in previous panels, is my power fantasy of, being able to slip on my Green Lantern ring and fly off to Oa and meet thousands of other aliens and have a big old dust up as well. And for myself, it was an early introduction into, for example, Asterix. For me, what was an early introduction into, once again, another power fantasy, taking your secret potion and dropping menhirs on people's heads and so forth. And I followed that all the way through to say, I can completely separate that this is a completely ridiculous concept of having your gods from the likes of Ares and Wonder Woman and so forth fighting technological beings, technological heroes like Blue Beetle and so forth. But I'm okay with that. There's so much weirdness and madness in the world anyway, to be able to sort of wrap it up and put it into a graphic novel, to say, or like Kingdom Come or something like that. It's absolutely fine for me. And if I want other characters or other parts of fiction, I can go elsewhere, and I'm okay with that.
Sure. There was, I'll be very quick in this, but there was a video that Jose was talking about last week, Oliver, and he was telling us, I don't know if you guys remember, but it was about the infantilization of pop culture. And before today's episode, I watched it, and it's pretty fucking damning. We may have to do a video about that concept, in that apparently there's a lot of man babies running around who may think that they're sophisticated because they happen to know episodes 1 to 12 of whatever mini-series, and that in itself, I don't know, I found the video fascinating. I really want to talk about this now, but it's not possible. Anybody else I think to say before Matt throws in some chaos, apparently?
No, go for it. Sorry, I'm
Go
just
ahead, Matt.
perplexed by the mom babies.
No worries. God, there was something I was thinking just as you were speaking then. Let me see if I can grab it. To do with, yes, the idea of having to divorce ourselves from certain aspects of current heroes. And I think that legacy of having so much history of male power fantasy combined with this kind of man baby thing, where if you have to progressify your heroes, then you're going to piss off some man babies, basically, because a lot of those power fantasies directly link to some of the things that, if you want to address some of these issues around representation, you're going to have to impact it somehow. And that kind of brings me on to the sort of the point that I noted earlier. I kind of have two aspects to this point. The idea of the flip, talking about Wicked, talking about these stories where you flip the script and you look at the other person's points of view, right? Now, in some ways, I think that has a really radical potential when you look at the old conventions on broadcast media, how the villains, you could only have like gay people in your shows if they were characterized as the villain, if they were in some way a deviant. You've got the characterization of trans people, I guess, if you look at people like Buffalo Bill, where they're maybe not, actually, I think in Silence of the Lambs, he's explicitly made out to be trans. Yes. But this idea that, you can only show these people in a negative light. If you then bring that onto, especially with Disney villains as well, a lot of them are portrayed to be camp in some way. When you start flipping the script like that, you can kind of empower a character that is given a somewhat of a non-cis het white male characterization. And I think that's got a lot of potential.
You're right.
But there is something else to that as well, which is how far do you take flipping the script?
Oh well, it
Yeah.
depends what your story is. I mean, we're talking about, let's face it, the carryover of Victorian sensibilities to point at that thing in the cage, or point in that thing in the outskirts of town, or that servant, or that creature, or that thing that you've turned into a golem when it actually was a person, you know. And that's carried over into films. Like if you look at Buffalo Bill, if you look at all these, especially the '60s villains. I mean, look at Doctor No. You know, that the world was afraid of China, so they invent Doctor No. You know, or at least film conspires with Fleming to give that negative idea flesh and bone, and it's completely accessible. You can go into an exhibition of Bond, and Doctor No will be there, and there'll be no particular analysis about what Doctor No stands for, except that he's now memorabilia of this long-running spy. Well, is James Bond really a spy? Another show. So he's very flamboyant. But yeah, essentially, how far can we flip the script? I feel that those questions in themselves are, and this is no affront to you, but it's very easy to answer. It's a case-by-case basis. If you flip it and it's within the logic of the actual story, then you're fine. But obviously, if you have people who are in charge of it, who are, let's say, awash with the idea of identity politics, with no other grounding other than they feel that they have a platform, then you're going to have bad story writing. You know, it's not enough to have a representation of someone or something and say, right, now they've got their day. It's like, where's the story? If the story's powerful enough, then anyone's going to be into it. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, definitely.
Do we find a point where somebody is so, do we think there is a point where someone is so irredeemably bad that if we tried to flip the scripts on them, we would be doing a disservice to culture, basically?
Well, they did that with
Go on.
sorry, I was just going to say they did that with, was it White Knight and the Joker character, where essentially they deemed him as sane, and he said that he was sorry for all his crimes, but this character was sorry, the Joker essentially went after Batman and put Batman on trial afterwards, and the entire sort of community of Gotham turned on Batman to say that he has actually created his own villains, which has been explored in many different stories as well. And essentially that is seen as the Joker's greatest victory over Batman without throwing a punch at all, which I find really interesting.
I think that, you know, that story in particular, it definitely signposts to me that when it comes to comics and mental illness, they pretty much never get it right. So there's a whole kind of fantasy idea of mental illness that they're using to say that the Joker is now sane. I mean, God knows how many people think that an asylum looks the way it does based on a lot of what happens in pop culture, let alone comics. So I don't know if we can really use that as an example for this particular topic. But I want to bring us back to Matt. Matt, you're saying if a character is so irredeemable, can we actually see through their eyes? Maybe it might be best to come up with a few examples, because I can't think of an irredeemable character, let's say Jack the Ripper, being our POV and us being forced to sympathize with him. You can't. Do you know what I mean? I like, say, Harvey Keitel or what's his name, Nicolas Cage in like Bad Lieutenant. That's a really fucked up guy, but I can watch from behind his eyes because I can figure out some of his story. A bit like Taxi Driver, you know. Like Bickle, he's got such a fascinating worldview, and you can see the child in him that hasn't necessarily been explained to as how the world works. He's just got back from Nam. He's got PTSD, and now he's a taxi driver. It's only going to get worse, you know. So I can get those stories. I can understand them. But
there's a character in the Five Bloods as well who when they go over to Vietnam, it's the four black characters, and one of them is a MAGA hat wearing Trump supporter as well, and he is a focal point character, and you do understand how he gets to that point, but he isn't redeemable as well. He's
the main character.
Delroy Lindo. So it's I guess he would be the main character. Yeah, but there's four of them.
Yeah, I have to see it. I think
it's weird Spike Lee. it's weird Spike
Weird
Lee as
Spike
usual.
Lee, I definitely have to see.
There's a very cool comic that has come out done by Garth Ennis that explores quite a lot of this stuff, like these themes of like good and evil and like who is actually redeemable. Has anyone read Red Team?
I've heard of it. It's basically they're assassins back in the day in the war, like female assassins. Am I right or wrong about this?
No, you're right. It's about a police unit that I think they're narcotics, and they end up going to kill this guy who they keep failing to catch, who is a drug dealer but also is involved in like some really horrible stuff like prostitution and exploitation of minors and stuff like that. And they go to kill him, and it's just about where you draw that line of like who's redeemable, especially like his brother gets involved, and I think it's the second book, and like you find out he's not as bad as he first seems, but it's just like you can actually start seeing through his eyes why he is the way he is, where he is a bad guy but he has some sense of morality, which I thought was just a nice lead in from what you guys were saying. But yeah, look it up, Garth Ennis Red Team. It's brilliant. It's 2 comic books.
I think Garth Ennis is a proper genius. I also think that my time handling skills are just about okay, right, Matt?
Yeah.
Was to call it into the show. Thank you so much for being on the show today, guys. Matt,
Thank you.
You're not talking to me. What the hell are you up to?
Yeah, I'm in a 3-piece band called Hearst Pile Up. Check them out. I just found out today actually that some of our music got used in a indie horror series about a bloodhound vampire drug dealer called
Nice.
which is incredible. You need to check it out. They Uncle Mickey Productions. It's absolutely fantastic. You really should check it out.
Have you got some kind of a link that you can send me?
I will send it to you. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll put it in the video description. So that's great. Thank you so much for that. So Mark, when you're not hanging out with me and Matt from Hearst Pile Up, what are you up to?
I don't really know. I'm probably going to go eat some food, and then I've got a little bit of coding to do for. I'm building a GPS rover, which is basically a satellite position, like a satellite position logger, so it can take like really accurate positions down to about 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters in height, and about 1 millimeter in sort of lateral distance. So you get like really accurate GPS points, but they're really expensive, so we're just going to build one.
Fantastic.
Nice.
Good to have you on the show. Simon,
Thank you.
when you're not hanging out with me, Mark and Matt, what are you doing?
Yeah, so I'm an event production specialist, majority of sort of wholesale events, but I also help companies transition their front shop online as well. So that's kind of what I'm focusing on now. And as I spoke about last time, I'm also helping a friend of mine get his film produced as well. So that's what
Brilliant. Good stuff. Well, thank you, Rantbox TV watchers. A new episode is uploaded every Friday before 12:30 p.m. noon. Do hit like and subscribe for more, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week's episode will be a music one. It'll be based, well, fixated on marketing one's band during the pandemic. How the fuck do you do it? I'll tell you how. Thanks for subscribing, and see you next Friday. Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.